stagnation in growth. So here I am. What I would like to do is to first say that the main issue, this is the issue that actually provides the basis of the work that we did. And in fact, this was a question asked by Kondasu when he first became managing director of the IMF. And that is that economic growth and high inflation are not compatible, that the high growth cannot be sustained if there is instability. But he also mentioned that price stability without economic growth becomes an elusive goal, as we are finding out in Europe. But it's interesting that he actually, after posing this question, he just sort of really concentrated on the first part of it, that growth is inhibited by economic instability, and very little attention was given to creating conditions for economic growth. So I will be addressing these four questions. First of all, I would like to clarify that how serious is Pakistan's inflation. The second question is, can inflation be reconciled with growth? Then, can growth help overcome macroeconomic imbalances? In other words, that can you get macroeconomic stability through achieving economic growth? And fourthly, then if growth is to take place, how will it come about? Because if you're trying to achieve macroeconomic stability at the same time as you are seeking growth, then you have to identify what are the non-inflationary triggers of economic growth. So that's how this is structured. So first of all, I would like to discuss the issue of how serious is the inflationary situation in Pakistan in a historic setting, and also taking a look at the global experience. And what we found was that actually the link between inflation and growth is very ambiguous. This data covers actually a period from 1965 to 2010 and covers several regions of the world. And you see that you have experiences of, there's no pattern to it. And this is actually supported also by Pakistan's own experience during the last 20 years. It's also without any particular pattern, that you have periods of high growth with low inflation, low growth with high inflation, so middling sort of middling situation too. But basically what you find is that Pakistan, the growth rate is clustered around, let's say, 4 to 6% over the last 20 years, and the inflation has been in the area of about 8 to 12%. Most of the observations fall in that category. But what is clear is that you cannot actually say that this is exactly how inflation brings about how inflation hurts economic growth. But what actually is evident is that there is a difference between the levels of levels of inflation that and there were several econometric studies done on the inflation growth link, and most of these were done in the 1990s by Fisher and Tom Bush and some in the World Bank. And basically what they established was that inflation, so long as it's under 20%, is not doesn't hurt economic growth very much. But that is a different period. Now we are living in a period of where there's actually great obsession with inflation, and therefore the threshold, as it is called, has come down. And again, there have been actually studies done on this. What is the threshold that each country can live with. And there's an IMF study which was done about 2 or 3 years ago, and it came up with that. So for the developing countries as a whole, they found that as long as the inflation is around 7 to 10%, that it doesn't actually hurt economic growth very much. Then there's a study by Mubarak in the State Bank of Pakistan, who did this study about 4 years ago, and he estimated that the threshold level for Pakistan was around 8 or 9%. That in other words, that if inflation is higher than that, it will begin to hurt economic growth. So this is actually to keep it in the back of our minds that when we look at the inflation today, I'm not saying that it's not something that one should not be concerned about, but whether it actually is hurting economic growth or whether there are some other factors which are inhibiting growth is worth looking at. Now, the other thing that we did was that we looked at the countries in the neighborhood of Pakistan, and we took Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. And here we find, we first looked at the growth experience. And in this regard, in terms of growth, the Pakistan line is green. You see that Pakistan's growth performance has been consistently worse than other countries, and in some cases actually substantially so. And of course, India has had much faster growth their economy. This is actually the behavior of the consumer price indices. Now here we see again that until about 2007, Pakistan inflation rate was actually in the middle of other countries, better than that of, let me get the colors right, Sri Lanka and better than India. But after 2007, there was a spike, and this inflation rate shot up to about 20%, more than 20%. But interestingly, in the very same year, you find that there were spikes, and that was largely on account of the import prices, that there was also, Sri Lanka had experienced a very large spike, and India also, though immediately after that, Sri Lanka's inflation rate came down. So in this regard, except for the last 3 years or so, one finds that Pakistan's inflation record is not too different from other countries which have actually been growing much more rapidly than Pakistan. Then we look at the key fiscal indicators, and here we find that as far as the central government debt is concerned, that again Pakistan actually is not too different from the others. Pakistan is actually its debt is much less than Sri Lanka's as a proportion of the GDP, and it is roughly at the same level as India's, though higher than Bangladesh's. Then we also looked at the tax revenue, because that is another issue which is frequently discussed, that Pakistan's performance in collection of tax revenue is much worse, that the performance is abysmal. Again, we find that Pakistan is very much in the same group of countries, that the tax ratio is not very different. Well, Sri Lanka is a star performer here at 14%, but again, I mean, it's not remarkably different from that. Now, if you look at the public deficit, this is by the average for 2005, 2009. Same sort of story emerges, that Pakistan is not too different from the other countries. Now, these are the key fiscal indicators. This is actually, we looked at the country policy international assessment by the World Bank, and you have the same story, that Pakistan's performance is not the worst of the lot. It's roughly the same as other countries. Now, remember, the reason why we are comparing it with these countries is because those countries have had a much better economic growth. trade than Pakistan. So the point being that the fact that you have fiscal imbalances or you have higher inflation by itself does not quite explain why Pakistan's economic growth has been particularly bad. Now this is actually, again, very quickly to look at the key macroeconomic indicators. You have current account balance. Here Pakistan is actually has had a much higher current account deficit, and it is actually also reflected in the savings and investment balance, that you find that Pakistan's performance, both in terms of domestic savings and rate of investment, is worse than all the other countries. And this factor probably is at the core of explaining why Pakistan's economic growth has been slow. Now, on the basis of these are the stylized facts which we used to actually develop a heterodox approach to economic growth. And the first stylized fact is, and this is just summing up what we found, the current fiscal and trade deficits need to be reduced for longer-term macroeconomic viability, but at current levels, unlikely to cause acceleration of inflation. Second, inflation is currently running high, but it should be possible to bring it down gradually with phased fiscal adjustment without hurting investment or economic growth. The point is this: that in this heterodox approach, we are emphasizing not a big bang approach, but a phased fiscal adjustment. The third stylized fact is that the trade and current account deficits are high, but do not appear to pose, at least for present, serious financing difficulties. Fourth, foreign exchange reserves should ideally be higher. At present, they are about 3 months of imports, but are currently adequate for meeting normal trade fluctuations. But there is very little room for more than that. If there is an untoward event, one could be in serious difficulty. Fifth, both foreign debt and domestic public debt need to be watched carefully because they can rise very quickly. But for present, again, they are manageable. There is no problem with it. By the way, this is also corroborated by the last IMF consultations, Article 4 consultations, which took place, I think, in November last year. Sixth, financial sector of Pakistan is by and large healthy. The risk of, there is a rise in the non-performing loans in the smaller banks, but overall, its capital ratios are okay, and serious banking crisis doesn't seem to be on the horizon. So this is actually where I just want to state as a reminder that all the same, despite all these observations that I've made, that the Pakistan economy is vulnerable, and any internal or external shock could actually put it in a very different category. So long as the current situation is not seriously affected, that we can actually start thinking of a phased program of adjustment. So what we did was that our starting point was the IMF's framework, adjustment framework, which they use for developing a program. And this has been there now for about 50 years. The core has not changed because it's really based on national income identities and certain relationships. And this is basically that change in money demand is proportional to the change in. By the way, these are taken directly from the architect of this framework, that is Haque. And change in money demand is proportional to the change in money income. Number two, imports are a fixed proportion of the national income. Change in money supply is equal to change in foreign exchange reserves plus change in domestic credit. And finally, change in foreign exchange reserves is equal to trade balance plus net foreign transfers. So let me just very quickly describe what the IMF framework, what the causal direction is. This is a bit of a simplification, forgive me for that, but because in actual discussions that take place between the country and the IMF, there's a lot of iterative work done. They try various scenarios and so on, and they finally come to an agreement on what seems to be the most plausible one. But the causation runs something like this, that exports and foreign financing are exogenously specified, but the desired build-up of foreign exchange reserves is the goal, that you want to build up enough foreign exchange reserves so that the country is protected from untoward circumstances. So that's actually the rationale for IMF financing. And this gives the level of imports which are consistent with that. Then once the imports are determined, and because of the fixed proportion that they bear to the money income, there is a notion of what the level of the money income is. Money income through the velocity of circulation generates the money demand. And on the basis of that, given the build-up of the foreign exchange reserves, gives you the domestic credit creation. Now, this is basically, very simply put, the IMF framework. And it determines the money income. But actually, what happens is this, that in this exercise, output growth and inflation rate are left dangling. It is not my word, it was the one that used by Jacques Polak, that he said that this is actually something which has to be worked out. So this crucial thing, how output is going to be affected and how inflation is going to behave, is basically a result of negotiations and discussions and so on. So, taking this as a basis, the heterodox approach that we propose changes the direction a little bit. And that is that we specify the output and inflation levels that we want to achieve. Now, once the output and inflation is specified, that gives us the money income, and then money income gives us the money demand, and then desired build-up of foreign exchange reserves, etc. Now, at the same time, unlike the IMF model where the external financing is specified as an exogenous variable, we, in this exercise, took that to be dependent on the level of exports and imports and build-up of foreign exchange reserves, and that's what is the required level of foreign financing. So given money demand and build-up of foreign exchange, we come back to the domestic credit creation that is permissible under the circumstances. So we actually end up at the same point as the IMF's framework, but through a different route, by taking the output and inflation as specified goals. Now, this is possible only in the situations, some situations, but not all situations. You know, the IMF standard model was ideally suited for what were called overheated economies, particularly in the pre-Bretton Woods system, the 19th century Bretton system of fixed exchange rates, commitment to full employment, and so on. And there, when the economies got overheated, you had to actually compress. But what you are finding in the developing world, and now in today's Europe, is that there is enormous excess capacity. There is high level of unemployment, and you do not really have a situation of overheating, but you want to bring about the macroeconomic adjustment. When you try to bring about, macroeconomic adjustment in a declining economy, the task becomes that much harder. So this is exactly what's been happening in Pakistan, that you have a year of stabilization and the effort peters out because the growth goes down and macroeconomic balances don't correct. So you continue in that process of continuous IMF supported programs from time to time. Now, we did the exercises, and the paper itself has more details on how they were derived. The crucial difference of the heterodox approach is that we take the adjustment, macroeconomic adjustment, is staged over a period of time. Now, the IMF has two scenarios in the last as a result of the last consultation. There is the baseline scenario where GDP growth rate is actually remains at more or less the current rate. But then they have a reform scenario where actually there is a substantial improvement in the fiscal performance. And as a result of that, because the discussions took place somewhere in November or so, they expected that if the reforms were introduced in fiscal 12, that the improvement would already begin to materialize. So they show a gradual improvement over the next 5 years to rising to 5.5%, no more. Now, in the heterodox approach, as I said, this is something that we assert, or let's 3.4% to something like 7% over the next 4 years. Now 7% was the rate that actually there seems to be consensus on. It was a rate which was achieved during the 2004-2008 period. It's also a rate that the Planning Commission thinks would be nice to achieve in order to deal with the employment and other social expenditures. So now, as far as the baseline, as inflation is concerned, in the baseline projections of the IMF, the situation gets from bad to worse. From current level of about 12%, it goes up to 14%. Now, in the reform scenario, it goes down to 8% by the end of the period. Whereas in the heterodox scenario, we expect it to go down to 6%. Interestingly, that in both scenarios, whether the reform scenario or heterodox scenario, the money income growth is roughly the same. Oops. Sorry, can I go back? Now, this spells out the key differences among the scenarios, which is baseline. That again, the main difference is that we believe that the adjustment, fiscal adjustment, will be done more gradually from the current rate, estimated rate of 6.8% in fiscal 12 to about 3%. This is about the same as the reform scenario of the IMF. But again, as I said, repeatedly said that the main difference is that we do it gradually. Now the trade deficit similarly comes down. Reform scenario is put in brackets because they do not give separately the trade deficit, so we have inferred from the other data, but you again see that there's a gradual improvement. So I mentioned that the IMF framework also treats growth as something extraneous. So over time, when there was a great deal of concern being expressed at the lack of growth, so that the growth side was added on to the IMF program, and this was called the structural reforms, which meant actually the standard growth of the labor market, getting rid of labor market rigidities, deregulation, privatization, and so on. And similarly, in our case too, in heterodox, we believe that if we could generate growth outside the framework, then we can actually bring about the macroeconomic adjustment, because the growth is not coming out of the model itself. And here we have identified 3 triggers of non-inflationary growth. And the first one is, and actually these will be discussed in the subsequent sessions, I won't take up too much time on that, and these are basically, and I think that there will be a consensus on that one has first and foremost to deal with the energy crisis. The energy crisis is one which is actually very debilitating. It is actually hurting the industry, and if that could be dealt with, that would already make considerable difference to capacity utilization. The second trigger of non-inflationary growth is private investment. Now, in the scenario, heterodox scenario 2, that the resources that are available to the government because of the adjustment that is needed will be constrained. So they cannot actually give the kind of stimulus policies that they followed in the past to get the growth going. But in fact, we believe that it may not even be necessary if growth were to start, because in the heterodox scenario, the expenditures keep growing along with the growth of the GDP. Then the third area where we think that could also be a trigger for economic growth is the international competitiveness, because in the past the growth process in Pakistan has always come to an end because of a balance of payments crisis. Versus 2008 crisis was a result of very sharp increase in imports and very large trade deficit, and of course that led to but these will be discussed in the subsequent sections. Now, to sum up, the paper does not provide a strategy of how it will be done. That actually is the task of the government, but we have laid out a scenario which shows that accelerated growth is possible. And I think that if there is a process started of discussion of how to bring about the growth, and since we believe that the growth can materialize if for instance, the private sector were to start investing, and if the competitiveness area could be addressed, then to at least have the chance that the growth process started. Now, of course, the second speaker in this session will talk about the strategy, the framework that the Planning Commission has laid out. Now, they are making also calling for major reforms or various areas, but I don't think that what we are proposing is any more demanding than theirs. In fact, I believe that theirs is a very ambitious task, whereas we are proposing something which is well within the reach of the government. Thank you very much.